well, you know, because actually when I got back, you know, indeed the pandemic hit, and I thought, well, the founding of the World Health Organization, and indeed the way societies and nations ought to be behaving now, even in their own self-interest, because viruses and bacteria are no respecters of frontiers in a world connected by transport, by airlines and everything else. This is bound to be a moment when national self-interest comes second to global self-interest, as the motto of the COVAX scheme meant to distribute shared vaccines, buy up stocks of vaccines which could be given to the relatively poor part of the world, was no one is safe until everyone is safe. So I thought, oh, well, you know, this is one moment where, you know, how naive could I possibly be? This did not turn out to be the case. Countries that could afford to put down large sums of cash, including our own, bought up advanced stocks, while Sarah Gilbert and her lab in Oxford at AstraZeneca were just barely beginning to develop and had a very general idea of when a vaccine would be successfully achieved, much less distributed. And the low point for me, when I realized how naive that was when Boris Johnson's government, possibly him or I can't remember if Matt Hancock, remember him, I think it was Matt Hancock there, withdrew from the European early warning. There's a pool of information about pandemic early warning which the EU set up and which they made clear would not be affected by a Brexit vote or by, you know, Britain's position via the EU, namely exiting from it. And in order to sort of not possibly be vulnerable to criticisms that you're still part of the European Union, at the start of the pandemic, we decided to withdraw from any future warning pool of scientific and epidemiological information. I thought, this is truly awful. So I started to think, my wife is a biologist, retired now, but she's a geneticist working on cell differentiation in early implanted embryos. And so, you know, science is talked a lot in our house. And I said I'm sort of getting really interested in not only our present perplexity, but in, you know, the way history might have something to say about earlier pandemics and epidemics. And, you know, and so I said, you know very well your husband has a horrible case of imposter syndrome. You know, how much more of an imposter can he possibly be? And she said, well, I'll read the manuscript, you know, if there is one, which she did, bless her. Thank you, Jenny. And so I got more and more interested, and there was a turning point. When I went to, I thought, well, the founding, looking desperately for a kind of redemptive moment when my slightly more, you know, expansive and optimistic, as you know, Kavita, I'm a kind of glass half full person, you know, looking for something. I thought, okay, go to the founding of the World Health Organization in 1948 in San Francisco when the UN was being set up. It was the first specialized agency. And that it turned out to online, everything had to be online, obviously, and so much of my research was made available at archives online, revealed an extraordinary thing to me, something called the International Sanitary Conferences, which play a big part in the book, were founded first in 1851 to deal with cholera, when in the aftermath of, there were two horrific outbreaks in this country as well as in France. Well, actually, more than two. The first one was 1817, then was a very big one in 1832, and then another very big one, 1848-49, which was traced to the notorious Broad Street pump in Soho by incredible forensic work of John Snow. And in 1851, it was sort of already known by some of the more forthright and you know, clear-sighted scientists. This is before anybody had ever seen a virus or a bacillus or a bacterial pathogen under a microscope. Well, and when I say before, actually, the first person who did see a pathogen under a microscope was also in 1851, a man called Filippo Pacini, and he never got any credit for it. It was thought to be so far-fetched. But in 1851, this organization, it's the first international organization which was not a military alliance and not a peace conference. And it was for global public health. It was trying to, to sort of surmount national and imperial barriers. The reason that is exactly, and I realize that, a lot of what I've written over many, many books actually kind of turns on that. My book about, the French Revolution is really about a phenomenon which ought to have been a consummation of Enlightenment philosophy, really, of Montesquieu and Rousseau, insofar as they can be reconciled, but turns into a kind of nightmare of mad theatrical violence, some licensed by the state, some not licensed by the state. And I guess with this book, I've come to realize, in a kind of sort of way, that we think of, because history books are, often organized in stages, really, that you've got your Enlightenment, and then something doesn't quite work out as expected, and then you've got your Romantic nationalism. But that's actually not true. The books, the founding formative texts about German nationalism, for example, by Johann Gottfried Herder, for example, are published in the 1760s, around exactly the same time as Rousseau and Diderot in the Encyclopédie. So these kind of extraordinary, terrible twins, which march together into modernity, scientific, analytical science and empirically acquired knowledge, and upholding as utterly authentic to human behavior impulse and instinct, and therefore, while not necessarily being delighted by it, accepting it's part of what it's like to be a human being, to be irrational and hysterical and paranoid and the subject of nightmares. And this has gone on, and that's why, my wonderful history teacher was wrong, because really the Enlightenment vision was that one day, as science and education progress, poverty and superstition, particularly religious superstition, and horrible disease will vanish from the face of the earth. And all the time, this sort of, gremlin world of the other dark side of our natural instinct, of our wiring, was going straight ahead. And what is surprising and incredibly depressing is how much it continues to be the case now.